So in my last video I talked about the possibility that Poppy has two personalities, an innocent one and then a more sinister one. But in that video I didn't really talk about Poppy's plan. At the beginning of chapter 2, Poppy was very helpful and her goal seemed to be to escape the factory with us. But spoilers, at the end of the chapter she seems to betray us, keeping us in the factory, not letting us leave, and telling us that she has a plan. A plan that involves us, and a plan that I'm betting isn't exactly what we want. So in today's video I'm going to attempt to explain exactly what this plan is. What does Poppy have in store for us, and is it going to be as dark as I hope? So at the end of chapter 2, Poppy says this.
But you saved me. You are perfect. Too perfect to lose.
She says we are perfect, too perfect to lose, and then she decides that we're not allowed to leave the factory just yet. Well, why is she keeping us here? What is her plan exactly? Well, I have two different interpretations of this. The more obvious and logical interpretation, which most people have probably already thought a little bit about, and then also a less obvious, a more sinister and much darker interpretation of her words. So let's tackle the most obvious one first. So I bet most of you are thinking that Poppy wants us to get rid of the rest of the experiments in this factory. And that actually would make a lot of sense. The residents of this factory are, well, abominations. Scientifically speaking, they shouldn't be able to exist in the form that they do. We had a little bit more of an explanation of exactly what these experiments are in chapter 2. And it's pretty much confirmed at this point that they do contain at least some amount of a human being. Whether that's just the personality, the brain, or even more, we still don't know the exact details, but we can confirm that some of these experiments at least were originally human beings, and we know this from Mommy Longlegs being originally a subject called Marie Payne. So likely these people were being transferred into these dolls. They could in fact still have their brains in there. In fact, their entire brain could have been transplanted into these dolls. If you look at each of these dolls, they all have oversized heads, which is not uncommon for children's toys, but also could be a very convenient way to stuff a brain in there. After all, anything that moves like this needs to have some sort of brain, and it makes sense that Poppy and Mommy that can fully talk like this probably have a full working brain inside them somewhere. So most likely, Poppy wants us to get rid of these experiments. This would make a lot of sense. These experiments are basically abominations. Think about this as well. This was all a secret operation. This entire area of the factory was built in secret, and it was built underneath where many people wouldn't know that it exists. In fact, even many of the workers of the factory didn't know it exists, and we know this from Marcus's tape. Many of the regular employees of Playtime Co. had no idea what was going on right below their feet, which is kind of creepy if you think about it. So why was it all kept a secret? Well, pretty obviously these experiments were not only highly unethical, they were also highly horrific. You cannot just do any experiment you want. To do an experiment, the proper way anyway, you first of all have to get approval from some sort of scientific body. And all of these approval have to go through an ethics check to make sure that you're not doing anything, well, like this for an example. This is why these experiments were done in secret, because I absolutely guarantee you, if you tried to run this by an ethics board, they'd say a big fat no. I do also want to point out here that in the past, ethics weren't quite as well established as they are today, and this is why we have plenty of examples of experiments going wrong. For example, the Stanford prison experiment. This experiment put people in different roles. Some people were prisoners and some people were guards, and let's just say this experiment didn't exactly go to plan. This experiment had devastating consequences for some of the participants, and it's used today as an example of why ethics are just so important. But on that note, this could also mean that the reason why this was done in secret was so that nobody else could steal this research, nobody else could use it, and nobody else could profit from it. I just wanted to add that in here because today's ethical standards are much higher than they used to be, and we know that Playtime Co.'s experiments could have started as early as the 60s, when ethics were, well, pretty much non-existent. And this led to the scientists having absolutely free reign over their experiments. Now the big danger of this, and the reason why ethical councils are so important, is because having free reign over experiments naturally leads people towards human curiosity. It's a very slippery slope, but one experiment leads to another, and before you know it, you're transferring orphans into living dolls. So when Poppy says she wants to set things right, the most obvious and logical explanation is that she wants to completely end these experiments once and for all. And after all, we know that she seems to be okay with the fact that we killed Mommy Longlegs, which also implies that she knows this is the right thing to do. So the most likely explanation is that Poppy wants us to go around the factory, eliminate these experiments one by one, leading up to a final showdown with experiment 1006. After we eliminate him, that leaves one very important question. What will we do with Poppy? After all, Poppy does seem to be nicer than the other experiments, but she is, scientifically speaking, just as much as an abomination as all of the others. This could mean that our final act in Playtime Co. is to put an end to Poppy, giving her that final sleep, which would be very ironic since when we found her, she was also in a deep sleep. So that's the most obvious and logical interpretation of what she's saying, but I actually have a much darker, much more sinister interpretation of what she could possibly mean at the end of chapter 2. So let's listen again to what she says. She says you are perfect, too perfect to lose, and she also says she knows that we are capable. Now, I believe that Poppy had a revelation throughout chapter 2. Even if she does have two personalities like I've suggested, I do think Poppy has realized that she's not as capable as she once thought. During chapter 2, Poppy was taken by Mommy. Not only was she taken, but she was paraded around like this, and then she was also bound by Mommy Longlegs with her webbing. She was completely incapacitated, she had absolutely nothing that she could do, and once the player arrives, she is completely at our mercy. Now I think Poppy realized this and realized that ultimately she can't leave the factory in this form. After all, I've already talked in previous theories that if Poppy did leave this factory, that probably wouldn't end well for her. After all, most people wouldn't react kindly to a living doll like this, and I'm sure that somebody would alert the authorities, and knowing humanity, somebody would probably try to experiment on her to reverse engineer the scientific process. People would want to find out exactly how she was created and try and use her for their own purposes. And as Poppy realized in chapter 2, there isn't much she could do to stop this. Not only is she incredibly small, but she's also incredibly weak, not even able to free herself from this webbing. So what does this imply? What is her plan? Well, remember we talked about these experiments. While we don't know the exact process of how people were transferred into dolls, we do know that human subjects were transferred into dolls somehow. Again, whether it's their brain or their consciousness, we don't entirely know, but we do know that these living dolls were brought to life from people. Well, who's to say that the reverse isn't also possible? Remember when Poppy said we are perfect, too perfect to lose, and she also said we are capable? Well, what if she's realized that she needs a human body to leave this factory? A human body that has just delivered itself to her. Knowing full well that this process is possible, there is absolutely nothing to say that the reverse process couldn't happen. Poppy could transfer her own consciousness into us. She could essentially steal our body. Now this has huge implications for the story. We know that experiment 1006 is going around the factory, taking dolls and making them a part of him. This weird amalgamation of dolls is increasing in size, strength and power every single time it does so. So even if the reversal process isn't perfect, it's entirely possible to combine two dolls together. Well, yet again, what if that process is possible with a doll and a human? It's not exactly too far-fetched when we know that humans have been transferred into dolls in the first place. So either Poppy wants to take our body, implanting her own consciousness into us, or she wants to join with us. Either way, pretty creepy. This would be the only way that Poppy would be able to leave the factory. She wouldn't be able to leave in her current form, and even if she did, she wouldn't get very far. But this brings up another very interesting point. So far, Poppy hasn't once mentioned experiment 1006. Now we know that other experiments are aware of 1006. After all, Mommy Longlegs did say once we kill her, "You'll make me a part of him." She's well aware that 1006 is going around the factory taking dolls, so if she's aware, Poppy could also be aware too. And if Poppy is aware of 1006, why didn't she tell us? That could be because she's working with 1006. There is absolutely nothing to say that 1006 isn't working with other dolls in this factory, and in fact, maybe that's why Mommy didn't like Poppy. We see that Mommy didn't want to be part of 1006, and she also didn't particularly like Poppy, which is very interesting as she's supposedly very protective of the other experiments. So why isn't she protective of Poppy? Is that because she knows Poppy's a threat because Poppy and 1006 are working together? And if you think about 1006, 1006 is incorporating human body parts into its own body. And what if Poppy wants to do the same thing? This would lead to an incredibly interesting showdown at the end of the game, us versus 1006 and Poppy. We still don't know exactly who 1006 is. It does seem very interesting. It hasn't seemed to take Poppy, while Poppy was incapacitated, as she puts it, for a very long time. Whether Poppy is working with 1006 or not, it does seem she definitely has a plan, and she has already admitted that we are a key part of it, whether that means as a helper or as a host. Either way, I'm not sure, but I'm very excited to find out. So this is my theory on what Poppy's plan is. Let me know what you thought of it down in the comments below. If you did like the video, don't forget to give it a like, and as always, consider subscribing so you don't miss out my future theories. Thank you very much for watching, and I will see you next time.